thank you very much for that fine speech. We now turn to our first speech in order, please. Sorry. We now turn to our first speech in opposition of the motion, which is from Sophie Bolt. Sophie Bolt is the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and she has been a long-time peace campaigner. Sophie, you have the ears of the House.
So it's a real pleasure and honour to be here at the Cambridge University debate, and I'm very honoured to be speaking with such amazing opponents and also supporters. So, of course, I'm speaking against the proposition the House believes Britain's military must expand. Today, we are confronted with a myriad of interconnected crises: economic instability and growing austerity, continuing wars and threats of military expansion, growing global poverty, the acceleration of climate breakdown, the rise of the far right, and the threat of nuclear confrontation. The British government and defence establishment argue that the response to these crises is that Britain has to arm up and prepare for World War III. Yet, the greatest global security threats we face are a result of issues that have no military solution. We can't bomb our way out of the climate crisis. They are intensively lobbying for Britain to increase its military capacity beyond the current 2.3% of GDP, that's 57 billion for this year, towards 2.5% of GDP, and possibly even beyond that to the whopping 5% of GDP being pushed by President Trump. And when we look at British foreign policy, we see that Britain is actually driving us closer towards this terrifying prospect of another world war. Instead, Britain needs to halt the drive towards greater military and nuclear expansion. I am going to look at Britain's aggressive escalation in the Ukraine war and its role in the AUKUS nuclear alliance against China to show its current role in driving us towards war, not away from it. The war in Ukraine shows how military escalation against Russia, instead of securing peace for Ukraine, has prolonged the terrible conflict, increasing the death toll and risking the threat of nuclear war. There is no justification for Russia's invasion, but aggressive expansion of nuclear-armed NATO right up to Russia's borders, together with NATO's military involvement in Ukraine before the war, has significantly contributed to the conflict.
Point of information.
The military escalation has been actively driven by both Conservative and Labour governments. They have poured nearly £8 billion worth of lethal weaponry into the country, including radioactive depleted uranium. It has given Ukraine use of long-range missiles to attack deep into Russian territory, despite Russia's repeated threats to use nuclear weapons. Military experts across the political spectrum, including in Ukraine, have all agreed that this incredibly reckless and dangerous escalation has not changed the outcome of the war. There is now speculation of British and European boots on the ground in Ukraine as part of a post-settlement scenario. This is absolutely fraught with dangers, because when we look at Britain's involvement in the disastrous US-led wars and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, the prospect of a protracted, deadly engagement in Ukraine between nuclear-armed Russia and nuclear-armed NATO would be absolutely catastrophic. And this is why I am arguing against British expansion, military expansion. Now, I also want to briefly touch on the destabilising role Britain is playing in the Asia-Pacific. As part of the AUKUS Treaty, the nuclear alliance between Britain, Australia and the US, Britain is supporting Australia secure nuclear-powered submarines, bringing more nuclear technology into an increasingly militarized part of the world, where accidents or further provocations could flare up into a full-scale war. The treaty builds upon President Obama's Asian pivot, as it's called, a policy started nearly 15 years ago, which aims to contain and stall China's economic development through increasing military threats. This has seen the refocusing of US military, strategic, and naval resources towards the Asia-Pacific, with over now 400 US military bases encircling China. This, along with Britain's hugely provocative, huge naval exercises in contested waters in the South China Seas and the Taiwan Straits, has also increased tensions with China. So Britain's role is incredibly dangerous, and I would argue disingenuous here. Whilst it argues against China's nuclear expansion, it is driving nuclear proliferation in the region. And whilst it argues Britain must arm itself to defend against an aggressive China, it is actually provoking a military confrontation. So it is in this context that I address my final argument against military expansion. That is to oppose the upgrade of Britain's nuclear weapons and NATO's nuclear sharing policies. Globally, there are currently about 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world, held by 9 nuclear weapons states, the vast majority by the US and Russia. The sheer scale of their destructive power can kill millions of people, destroy vast swathes of the planet, creating years of global famine for those who do survive. Nuclear weapons hold such terror to the majority of the world's population precisely because nuclear weapons states effectively hold the survival of the planet to ransom. This is not a sustainable defence policy. And the development of so-called tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons, these with a smaller destructive power, only increases the likelihood of them being used. As part of NATO's nuclear sharing policy, US nuclear weapons have been stationed at bases across Europe. And right now, the US is deploying such tactical nuclear weapons. They're called the US B-6112s. And that includes here in Britain. And just over 20 miles away, Britain could now actually be hosting these US nuclear bombs at RAF Lakenheath Air Base. And we know that it's the deployment of these tactical nuclear bombs to Britain that has already triggered Russia to site its own nuclear weapons in Belarus. This is the first time since the Cold War that Russia has sited nuclear weapons outside its territory. So NATO's nuclear sharing is actively driving nuclear expansionism and is increasing the threat of nuclear use.
Point of information.
And then there is the colossal cost of nuclear weapons. Britain is now building 4 new nuclear submarines at an estimated cost of at least £205 billion over the 30-year lifetime. But huge maintenance and construction delays have resulted in out-of-control costs. Even the government's own finance watchdog has called the system unaffordable. And to date, the government has failed to publish the 2023 update on revised costs. And there is also the long-term military effectiveness of our nuclear weapons system. According to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, by 2050, technological advances in detection technology could make these submarines completely useless. And as well as the environmental devastation from a nuclear war, there is the ongoing carbon bootprint of the military industry, which is over 5.5% of all carbon emissions, a huge contributor to global warming. So, given the terrible dangers of nuclear weapons, as well as the serious military and economic problems, the British government should halt the replacement of these nuclear submarines. It should use the billions left to drive real, sustainable, genuinely productive economic growth, not the destructive waste of billions that military spending really means. So in conclusion, we need to reject the failed strategies that have got us to this interconnected crises. This means building global cooperation to halt climate breakdown. It means seriously developing a common security approach to resolving global tensions, an approach that takes account of all countries' security needs, and for the British government to use its role in the world to establish critical international arms controls treaties, so we can actually have a future that we can look forward to. Thank you.